The towering Victorian monstrosity loomed at the edge of the small New Hampshire town, wrapped in ivy and shadow, as if trying to disappear into the surrounding forest. Emily stood at the wrought iron gate with her duffel bag slung over one shoulder, staring at the place she had once visited as a child. Back then, it had felt magical, a labyrinth of endless hallways and secret nooks. Now, with her aunt gone, it felt ominous, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Her late Aunt Rose had been a recluse for as long as Emily could remember. Family reunions always carried whispered tales of her eccentricities, tales of seances, peculiar journals, and unexplained disappearances of visitors who overstayed their welcome. When the lawyer read the will, leaving the house to Emily, it came with one peculiar warning. Do not enter the room at the end of the east wing. Emily's curiosity had ignited at once. She crossed the overgrown yard and pushed open the heavy front door. The air inside was musty, thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories. Sunlight filtered weakly through the stained glass of the front foyer, casting strange, kaleidoscopic patterns on the walls. The grand staircase rose in front of her like a spine, its balusters curling like the ribs of a beast. To the left lay the east wing, a corridor shrouded in shadows. A shiver ran down Emily's spine as she stared at it. Shaking off the unease, she made her way through the house, surveying the remains of her aunt's life. The parlor was littered with moth-eaten furniture, the kitchen still held jars of dried herbs, and the library was stacked with books on folklore and the occult. As night fell, Emily made herself a makeshift bed in the parlor. She told herself she would start cleaning up the house in the morning, but her thoughts kept circling back to the warning. Why had Aunt Rose cared so much about that one room? The first strange thing happened just past midnight. Emily had drifted into a restless sleep when a faint noise woke her, a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, she thought it was a branch brushing against the window, but when she sat up, she realized it was coming from inside the house. She followed the sound down the east wing, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. The tapping grew louder as she approached the last door at the end of the corridor. Her aunt's warning echoed in her mind, but her curiosity overpowered her caution. The door was locked. Emily leaned in, pressing her ear against the wood. For a moment, there was silence. Then, she heard it, a faint, whispering voice. She stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. The whispers were unintelligible, like the murmurs of a crowd in a distant room. The door rattled slightly, as if someone, or something, on the other side wanted to be let out. Emily ran back to the parlor, locking the door behind her. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she sat in the dark, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Sleep didn't come again that night, but when the morning sunlight poured through the windows, she convinced herself it had all been a trick of her imagination. But as she passed the door the next day, she noticed something new. The key was now hanging from a rusty hook above the frame. And the whispers had started again. Emily's fingers hovered over the old key, her pulse racing. "Don't do it," she muttered to herself, retreating a step. Yet the whispers persisted, faint but insistent, curling like smoke through the cracks of the door. They didn't sound threatening. If anything, they seemed pleading. She tore her eyes away and stormed back to the kitchen, determined to busy herself with cleaning. Old dishes were stacked in the sink, layers of dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners like forgotten memories. It felt good to focus on something tangible, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the east wing. Why had Aunt Rose locked that door? And why leave the key where it could be found so easily? By late afternoon, Emily had convinced herself she needed answers. Armed with a flashlight and a hammer, just in case, she made her way back to the corridor. The air grew colder as she approached the door, a draft prickling her skin. The whispers stopped abruptly when she reached for the key. For a moment, there was only silence, oppressive and thick. Emily slid the key into the lock. It turned with an unsettling ease, as though the door had been waiting. She pushed it open. The room beyond was unlike the rest of the house. Where the other spaces were cluttered and decaying, this one was pristine. The walls were lined with shelves that held dozens of jars filled with murky liquid, each containing what looked like fragments of something organic. Her stomach churned as she stepped inside, her flashlight beam sweeping the room. In the center stood a low wooden table, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift under her gaze. On it rested a large leather-bound book, its cover emblazoned with a symbol that made her head throb just looking at it. Her aunt's journal. Emily hesitated but then picked it up, flipping to the first page. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, as if written by someone in a frenzy. To whoever reads this, do not trust the whispers. They will say anything to escape. Anything to convince you to open the second door. Her flashlight wavered as she glanced around. Second door. She hadn't noticed another. But then her beam caught it, a narrow panel at the far end of the room, partially obscured by a tall shelf. Unlike the first door, this one was reinforced with iron bars and chained shut. The whispers returned, louder now, coiling in the corners of her mind. Emily turned the page. The entity was not always here. I brought it with me in a moment of desperation. I thought I could contain it. I was wrong. The first door keeps others out, but the second door keeps it in. If you value your life, leave this house now. Lock the first door behind you. Burn the key. Her hands trembled. A sudden thud made her whip around, her flashlight darting across the room. One of the jars had fallen from the shelf, shattering on the floor. The liquid inside hissed as it seeped into the cracks of the wood, and a dark, sinewy shape began to rise from the mess. It didn't have a form, not exactly. It was a mass of shifting darkness, tendrils reaching out as if searching. The whispers became screams. Emily stumbled back, clutching the journal to her chest. The shadowy figure surged toward her, and in its movement, she saw flashes, faces contorted in agony, hands clawing at nothingness, eyes wide with terror. She bolted for the door. Slamming it shut behind her, she jammed the key back into the lock and twisted it violently. The screams faded, replaced by a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. She collapsed in the hallway, panting, her back against the door. The journal lay open beside her, and her eyes caught one last entry, hastily scrawled across the bottom of the page. It doesn't stop. It never stops. Run while you can. But Emily knew she wasn't safe. The second door hadn't been opened. Not yet. But something from inside had gotten out. Emily barely slept that night. She bolted the door to her room and wedged a chair under the handle, though deep down she knew neither would protect her. Every creak of the old house sent shivers down her spine, each shadow seemed to shift unnaturally in the dim moonlight. She lay in bed clutching the journal, its pages crinkled from her trembling grip. Her aunt's frantic warnings echoed in her mind, it doesn't stop. It never stops. At some point, exhaustion overtook her, but her sleep was restless, plagued by dreams of shadows crawling beneath her skin, whispering her name in voices not her own. When dawn finally broke, the whispers quieted, replaced by an eerie stillness. Emily forced herself out of bed, determined to leave the house for good. She had a plan: pack her things, lock the east wing door as instructed, and burn the key. She was halfway through stuffing clothes into a duffel bag when she heard the sound. Faint at first, then louder, a rhythmic thumping, like someone knocking on the walls from inside the east wing. Her blood turned to ice. No, she muttered, shaking her head. She didn't need to check. She didn't need to know. Whatever it was, she wasn't going to let it drag her back. But the thumping grew insistent, rattling the walls. And then the whispers began again. Emily. Emily, help us. It wasn't one voice but many, overlapping in a cacophony of desperation. They didn't sound menacing this time. They sounded human. She froze, staring at the bolted door to the east wing. The voices pleaded, their tones so genuine that doubt crept into her mind. What if someone was trapped inside? What if her aunt had imprisoned something, or someone, that didn't belong there? Emily hesitated, then threw her bag down and grabbed the journal. She flipped through the pages, searching for more answers. There. Near the end. It imitates. It knows what you want to hear. Do not listen. Her hands trembled, the book slipping from her grip and falling to the floor. The whispers turned sharper, more insistent. Please, Emily. You have to open the door. She locked us in here. A chill ran down her spine. She, her aunt. Who were they talking about? She tried to block it out, dragging her duffel bag toward the front door. But just as she reached for the handle, the whispers changed. She's lying to you. The journal isn't telling you everything. Emily froze. What if there's more to the story? The voices coaxed. Don't you want to know the truth? Don't you want to know why she left you this house? Her grip on the doorknob faltered. Her aunt had always been secretive, evasive about the house's history. Could there really be another side to this? No, she whispered to herself. This is what it wants. She turned the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck, the old wood refusing to give. And then she smelled it, smoke. Emily spun around. Wisps of black smoke curled out from under the east wing door, twisting unnaturally in the air. The whispers grew louder, angrier. You can't leave us. The smoke thickened, spilling into the hallway, forming long tendrils that reached toward her. Emily stumbled back, her heart racing. She bolted for the kitchen, yanking open drawers until she found matches. Her aunt had said to burn the key. If the whispers were telling the truth, if her aunt hadn't been, none of it mattered. She needed to stop this. Emily grabbed the key from her pocket and lit a match. The flame flickered, her hand shaking as she held it under the metal. The key didn't melt. It didn't even heat up. Instead, the smoke surged toward her, the whispers rising to a deafening pitch. Don't you dare. The flame extinguished, and the key dropped from her hand. A tendril of smoke wrapped around her ankle, dragging her to the floor. She screamed, kicking and clawing at the air, but the smoke only tightened its grip. It was dragging her back toward the east wing. Toward the door. The whispers became one voice now, a deep, guttural sound that shook the house. You belong to us now. Emily's hand found the journal, and in a last desperate act, she hurled it into the tendrils. The smoke recoiled, hissing and shrieking as the book burst into flames. The fire spread unnaturally fast, licking up the walls and consuming the east wing door. Emily scrambled to her feet, coughing as the air filled with thick black smoke. She didn't look back. She didn't stop running until she burst through the front door, the cool morning air hitting her face. Behind her, the house groaned, flames engulfing it entirely. Emily collapsed on the gravel driveway, her chest heaving as she watched the inferno. For a moment, she thought it was over. But then, through the smoke and flames, she saw it. A figure standing in the ruins, untouched by the fire. It was wearing her aunt's face, but the eyes, they weren't human. Emily staggered to her feet and ran, leaving the house, and whatever still lived inside, behind her. Emily didn't stop running until she was far from the house, the dense forest surrounding her. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, her legs burning with exhaustion. Yet the image of the figure in the flames was etched into her mind, her aunt's face, twisted with something inhuman. She collapsed against a tree, clutching her chest, trying to convince herself she was finally safe. But the eerie silence of the woods felt suffocating, too still, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Behind her, a faint rustling sound broke the quiet. Emily whipped around, her eyes scanning the trees. "Hello," she called, her voice hoarse and trembling. No answer. Just the soft creak of branches swaying unnaturally in the still air. She clutched her arms, willing herself to keep moving, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, startling her. Relief washed over her as she fumbled to pull it out, desperate for a lifeline. A text message blinked on the screen. It was from a number she didn't recognize. "You can't run." Emily's stomach dropped. Her thumb hovered over the screen, but before she could react, another message appeared. "It's still inside you." The words sent a chill down her spine. Her heart pounded as she tried to convince herself it was a cruel prank. Maybe someone hacked her phone, someone who knew about the house. But that thought was just as terrifying. She deleted the messages, but they reappeared instantly. "You didn't burn it all." Emily froze. The journal. She had thrown it into the fire, hadn't she? But what if she hadn't destroyed everything? What if she had missed something vital? The rustling grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural hum. It came from all directions, an unearthly sound that made her blood run cold. She broke into a sprint, her phone slipping from her grasp as she raced through the woods. Branches tore at her clothes and face, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Ahead, a faint light broke through the trees, a road, salvation. Bursting onto the asphalt, Emily waved her arms wildly as a pair of headlights approached. A pickup truck skidded to a halt, and a grizzled man in his 60s jumped out. "Jesus, are you okay?" he asked, his face a mix of concern and shock. "Please," Emily gasped. "You have to take me out of here." The man hesitated, his eyes darting to the forest behind her. "What happened?" "Just drive," she screamed, grabbing his arm. He nodded, helping her into the truck. The engine roared to life, and the truck sped down the road, leaving the cursed woods behind. Emily slumped against the seat, tears streaming down her face. She didn't have answers, only the suffocating weight of dread. The man glanced at her, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "You came from that house, didn't you?" Emily's head snapped up. "You know about it." He didn't answer immediately. His face was grim, his eyes fixed on the road. "People talk. Stories about that place. Anyone who goes in, they don't come back right." Emily's hands trembled in her lap. "What does that mean?" The man hesitated, then sighed. "It means you're lucky to be alive. But sometimes, what comes out isn't the same as what went in." She wanted to protest, to demand answers, but the weight of his words silenced her. The truck rolled into a nearby town, the neon glow of a diner sign illuminating the night. He pulled into the parking lot. "Go inside, get some food, rest. You look like hell." Emily nodded numbly and stumbled out of the truck. The diner was nearly empty, save for a waitress and a couple sitting in a corner booth. Emily slid into a seat near the window, her reflection faint in the glass. As she stared at herself, her heart skipped a beat. Her eyes. For the briefest moment, they weren't hers. They were red. The reflection grinned. Emily's scream shattered the quiet of the diner. The waitress and the couple rushed to Emily's booth, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. But Emily couldn't stop staring at the window. Her reflection was gone, replaced by the normal view of her pale, tear-streaked face. "What's wrong, honey?" the waitress asked, placing a hand on her shoulder. Emily opened her mouth to speak but hesitated. She couldn't tell them. How could she? They'd never believe her. Instead, she shook her head. "Nothing. I thought I saw nothing." The waitress frowned but didn't press further. She slid a glass of water onto the table and walked away, muttering something about shock. Emily sipped the water, her hands trembling. She had to think. Had to figure out what was happening. Pulling out her phone, she typed, "Cursed house stories," into a search engine. Hundreds of results appeared, and she scrolled through them frantically. None of them seemed connected to her experience, until she found a forum post titled, "What Comes Back? Survivors of the House." The post was written by someone named Elliot's Journal, and the description made her stomach churn. The house doesn't let go. If you've been inside, you'll never truly leave. It doesn't just haunt you, it becomes you. Emily's hands froze as she read the comments. Survivors talked about strange visions, hearing their names whispered at night, and, worst of all, seeing their reflections act independently. A cold realization gripped her. She wasn't alone anymore. As Emily stared at her phone, the glass of water on the table rippled, sending concentric circles across its surface. The lights in the diner flickered. "Hey, what's going on?" the waitress asked, looking up at the ceiling. The air grew heavier, colder. Emily's breath came out in small puffs of mist. Then, the radio at the counter crackled to life, broadcasting an eerie, static-laden voice. "Emily," it said, distorted but unmistakable. Everyone froze. The couple in the corner booth exchanged nervous glances. The waitress stepped back, her face pale. "Who's there?" she called out, but the voice ignored her. "Emily," it said again, louder this time. Emily shot to her feet. "Leave me alone," she shouted, her voice trembling. The reflection in the diner's window suddenly reappeared, but it wasn't hers. It was the same twisted face she'd seen before, the crimson eyes gleaming, the sinister grin wide and hungry. It tilted its head, mocking her. Then, it stepped out of the glass. The entire diner erupted into chaos. The waitress screamed, the couple bolted for the door, and the lights shattered, plunging the room into darkness. Emily stumbled back, knocking over her chair as the figure lunged toward her. But it didn't touch her. Instead, it whispered in her ear. "You can't run from what's inside." Emily felt her strength drain. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the floor. The last thing she saw was the figure standing over her, smiling as her vision faded to black. Emily woke up hours later in an empty diner. The chairs were overturned, the windows shattered, and the air smelled of burnt plastic. She struggled to her feet, her body aching, her mind clouded. Looking at her reflection in a shard of broken glass on the floor, she saw nothing unusual. Just her. But something inside her felt off. The phone in her pocket buzzed. She pulled it out and read the message. "Welcome home." Months later, rumors spread of a young woman wandering from town to town, her presence followed by chaos and unexplainable events. Some say she talks to herself. Others swear her shadow doesn't match her movements. And in every town she visits, someone disappears. The house may have let Emily leave, but it didn't let her go.